cabin pressure shifted 3,000 meters above the Atlantic, but it was nothing compared to the sound tearing through rows 38 to 44. Junha, 2 years old, dark eyes swollen with a grief he couldn't name, screamed. Not the ordinary cry of a tired toddler. This was the primal, open-throated howl of a child whose body remembered loss before his mind could process it. His small fists thrashed against the seat in front of him. The teddy bear he'd clung to in the hotel room lay abandoned on the cabin floor. Around him, passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others already reaching for their noise-canceling headphones. Myung-seok held his grandson with the grip of a man defusing a bomb. His left hand supported the boy's back. His right rested on the armrest, fingers spread so rigidly they might have been fused to the leather. The CEO of LS International Group, a man whose photograph appeared in Forbes, whose boardroom decisions shaped technology markets across 4 continents, had no answer for a 2-year-old's anguish. The cabin lights caught the silver of his watch. 15,001. He'd stopped wearing it the day his son died. Wait, he was wearing it again. He'd checked the time obsessively since they'd boarded in New York, as if minutes could be counted down to safety, to resolution, to the moment he could hand this child to someone who knew what they were doing, someone who belonged in the role of comfort. Because Myung-seok had built an empire on the principle that emotional labor was delegated, compartmentalized, and never, never allowed to compromise quarterly returns. Now his grandson was destroying that philosophy at 40,000 feet. "Sir, would you like me to bring some water?" The flight attendant leaned down, her professional smile bent at an angle that suggested she'd asked this question 4 times already. "The baby needs to sleep," Myung-seok said, his English perfectly accented but utterly helpless. "We're going to Seoul. He needs to sleep so he can..." He stopped. "So he can what? Adjust to the penthouse where his parents used to be? To the nannies who had never met him before? To the grandmother who wept silently into her pearls?" Junha's scream crescendoed, then fractured into something worse, a hitching, desperate sob. The kind that comes from deep cellular memory. The child had lived 2 years with his mother and father in Washington, D.C. He'd known their voices, their hands. The particular way his father smelled like coffee and expensive cologne mixed with the playground dirt, neither of his parents could quite wash away fast enough. 3 weeks ago, a car accident on the M Street Bridge had erased all of that. Myung-seok's eyes stayed fixed on the window. Outside, the darkness was absolute. No stars, no moon. Just the reflection of his own face, lean, controlled, aged 10 years in the past month. The face of a man who had learned that power meant nothing when death made its appointments. "Perhaps if we move to the back of the cabin?" the flight attendant suggested, her tone edged with the diplomacy that comes from knowing a first-class passenger could buy or break her career. "There's more space, and I paid for this seat," Myung-seok interrupted, not unkindly. "It's adequate." It wasn't adequate. Nothing was adequate anymore. The spacious seat felt like a coffin. The cabin felt like a prison made of aluminum and recycled air. And his grandson felt like proof. Proof that Myung-seok had failed to protect anyone he loved. Proof that all his money and influence couldn't rewind time. Proof that he was precisely what his ex-wife had told him he was in those final arguments, the ones that had driven his son to prove himself through overwork, through the desperate bid to show he was worthy of the empire his father had been handed. A ghost who wore the right suit. Junha's crying had shifted into something more broken. Hiccups. Gasps. The sound of a small body surrendering to exhaustion but too wounded to rest. Behind them, a passenger stabbed his call button. Myung-seok didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. The digital grid of this aircraft was no different than the grid of society. A calculation of who deserved space, whose discomfort mattered, whose child's grief was acceptable collateral. He pressed his lips against the top of his grandson's head, a gesture as programmed as a corporate gesture could be. His arms tightened. He had learned this motion not from his own father, who had rarely touched him, but from watching his son do it, thousands of times, with a naturalness that seemed to come from a genetic code Myung-seok had somehow failed to inherit. "Please, Abeoji," Junha gasped in Korean, the child's corruption of the formal word for father. "Please, Oapa." The child was calling for a dead man. And in that moment, in the exact moment when the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for either silence or intervention, or the kind of social rupture that would require the flight crew to make difficult decisions, a woman stood up from seat 42B. She was unremarkable in the way that only true composure can be. Tall, built like someone who had spent decades moving through a world that hadn't always moved for her. Dark skin. Hair tied in a low bun so neat it seemed to have been accomplished not that morning but years ago, as if this hair arrangement was simply who she was. She wore a light blue cotton blouse, the kind you could probably wash in a sink, and a necklace with a single leaf pendant that caught the cabin light like a small green prayer. 42B rose, excused herself past her sleeping seatmate without waking him, and moved forward with the kind of deliberate gentleness that suggested she'd done this before. Not this specific thing, calming a bereaved Korean toddler on a transatlantic flight, but the underlying action, the stepping forward, the deciding that someone else's crisis was more important than propriety. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was low enough to cut through the cabin noise without adding to it. "I'm sorry to interrupt. May I?" She was looking at Myung-seok, not at the child, not at the crying, at him. And in that small deference, in the asking permission, rather than offering help as a charity, something in the CEO's chest loosened just fractionally enough to let him nod. She bent down with the kind of ease that came from being a woman who had held many children, many times. Her hands were open, not reaching, but offering. "Hi there, love," she said to Junha in English, then repeated it in softly accented Korean. "Annyeong, Guyun." Junha's crying stuttered. "I know something is broken inside you right now," the woman said, and the cabin fell absolutely silent. Even the engines seemed to pause. "I know because I can hear it. And it's okay to be loud about that. It's okay. But I'm wondering if you'd like to sit with me for a minute. Just to breathe. Sometimes we forget how to breathe when we're sad. Did you know that?" She extended her hand, not to take him, but to invite him. Myung-seok felt the hesitation in his grandson's small body, the pulse of a decision being made at a level deeper than language. Then, in a movement that felt like a miracle or a betrayal or both, Junha's hand reached out and took the stranger's. What happened next was the kind of moment that exists outside of narrative convention. The woman didn't try to distract him or fix him. She simply drew him close to her shoulder, careful, so careful, and began to breathe, deliberately, slowly. The kind of breathing that you could hear, the kind that said, "Here is my heartbeat, here is my rhythm. Let your body join mine in this." And somewhere between her third and fourth breath, Junha stopped screaming. Then he stopped crying entirely. The teddy bear remained on the cabin floor, abandoned, but the child's body began to align with the woman's, his breathing slowly matching her own. She didn't sing to him. She didn't tell him it would be okay. She simply held him and breathed. And somehow that was enough. Enough to break the hysteria. Enough to create space for something other than anguish. Passengers turned away, one by one, slightly ashamed to have been witnessing something so private. The flight attendant disappeared toward the cockpit, and Myung-seok sat frozen in seat 41A, his expensive hands now empty, his expensive heart now aware that somewhere in this aluminum tube traveling through darkness, Someone understood that the greatest kindness wasn't to make pain disappear. It was to prove that pain could be held, could be witnessed, could be survived. Some encounters don't happen by chance. They happen to mend what life has broken. This moment between these two strangers, this small, almost invisible act of compassion, is the real story of what happens when a broken man learns that strength sometimes means surrendering. When a child discovers he can still be soothed. When a woman carrying her own unspoken grief recognizes that sometimes the most powerful act is simply showing up. If this kind of redemptive storytelling speaks to you, if you recognize yourself in any of these characters, please subscribe to follow what happens after that plane lands. Because Myung-seok isn't the man to simply let this woman disappear, and Seraphine isn't about to return to her seat without knowing that something has shifted. And Junha, this small keeper of sorrow, has just learned that healing is possible. Subscribe so we can continue showing you that love doesn't replace loss. It remakes us. The landing in Incheon came with the kind of gray sky that seemed specifically designed to match Myung-seok's interior weather. Clouds hung low and heavy, promising rain that wouldn't arrive for hours. The tarmac stretched out like an endless boardroom, and already he could feel the weight of Seoul pressing down, the weight of the office waiting, the board waiting, the empire waiting for its captain to steer it back into sensible channels. He'd left all of that for 1 month. 1 month. To bring his grandson home. The flight attendant helped with the carry-on bag, while Junha, now drowsy and peculiarly peaceful, rested against Myung-seok's chest. The child's breathing had stabilized into something like sleep, his small fist still wrapped around a corner of the man's suit jacket. At some point, someone had tucked Junha's abandoned teddy bear into the diaper bag. Myung-seok didn't know who. He was looking for her, the woman from 42B. The cabin deplaned in the usual choreography of hurried movements and half-remembered conversations. Myung-seok moved slowly, deliberately out of step with the crowd, not searching, simply remaining present to the moment of her passing. She would pass. They were all passing. The miracle was over. That had always been Myung-seok's understanding of miracles. They were interruptions, temporary suspensions of normalcy. Not sustainable. Not real in the way that quarterly reports were real. But when he reached the gate, she was standing off to the side, clearly deliberating with a woman in a purple NGO badge about gate numbers and terminal directions. She didn't see him. That was important. She was speaking with genuine concentration, pointing at something on a printed itinerary, utterly unconcerned with whatever imprint she'd left on a crying child's memory. For her, the moment on the plane had been a moment. Good deed done. Conscience tended to. Back to regular life. Myung-seok had built his career on the understanding that people were, on the whole, forgettable. Employees, board members, competitors, lovers, his own father. They were roles to be managed, not individuals to be retained. And yet, he shifted Junha slightly, and the child's eyes fluttered open. The lady, Junha whispered in Korean, his eyes fixed on Seraphine. The breathing lady. Myung-seok felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been locked might be releasing. Or breaking. Possibly both. He approached with the kind of formal politeness that had opened doors across 5 countries. "Excuse me," he said. "I wanted to thank you." Seraphine turned. The moment of recognition took approximately 2 seconds. In her face, a face unmarked by the usual cosmetic calculations of his world, he watched genuine pleasure arrive and settle. Not seductive pleasure, not the strategic pleasure of networking. Just the simple pleasure of being acknowledged for having done something good. "Oh," she said, "the baby." She looked at Junha, and her smile transformed entirely. It became less social and more cellular, the kind of smile that seemed to involve every system in her body. "You're okay now?" she asked the child in Korean. "I breathed like you," Junha said seriously, as if reporting to a very important person. "You absolutely did. You breathed like a champion." She looked back at Myung-seok. He was carrying a lot of sadness. "Is he yours?" The question was innocuous, but it was also, Myung-seok realized, a test. A small measurement of whether he understood what the child was, not a possession, not even a responsibility in the way that companies or stock portfolios were responsibilities. "My grandson," he said. His parents were in an accident." "Oh." Seraphine's face folded into a knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. She didn't offer empty condolences. She simply said, "That's the worst kind of heavy." The way she said it, matter of fact, as if she recognized the specific weight of that particular rock, suggested that she, too, knew what it was to carry something that shouldn't fit inside a human body. "You're American?" Myung-seok asked, knowing the answer but needing the conversation to continue. "From Washington, D.C. Well, was. I've been living in Seoul for 3 years. I run programs for an NGO, early childhood education, mostly for refugee and immigrant families. I was actually just on my way to New York for some grant meetings, but..." She glanced at her watch. "Well, I'm heading back to Seoul today anyway. So I suppose the universe was efficient about it." Myung-seok heard this clearly. "I'm going back to Seoul." "The universe," he repeated, testing the word. In Korean business, they said, "unmyeong," fate. But it was understood as a force that needed to be managed, controlled, negated when possible. He'd never heard someone speak of the universe as if it might be efficient or kind. "I believe in small miracles," Seraphine said simply. This was one. He needed something, and I could provide it. That's lucky. A lot of people pass right by the things they could actually help with. Her friend from the NGO, Yoon-hae, as Myung-seok would later learn, was gesturing that she needed to move toward baggage claim. Seraphine nodded an acknowledgement but didn't immediately leave. "I hope things get easier," she said to Junha, then extended her hand to Myung-seok. Her grip was warm, firm, not affected. "I'm Seraphine, by the way. Seraphine Holt." "Lee Myung-seok." He found himself holding her hand a moment longer than professional etiquette demanded. "I don't usually ask strangers for their information." "I know," she said. And again there was that peculiar knowing in her expression. "You're the kind of man who doesn't ask for anything. But your grandson just needed something, and you couldn't give it alone. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you human." She smiled one more time, at Junha, who waved shyly with his small fingers. And then she was gone, pulled into the current of travelers moving toward ground transportation, toward Seoul, toward whatever came next. Myung-seok stood holding his grandson in the international arrivals section of Incheon Airport while the building moved around him. The air smelled like jet fuel, and someone's expensive perfume, and the particular stale quality of recycled airplane air that never quite left your clothes. Junha had fallen back asleep, his head tilted at an angle that suggested his neck might suffer for it. But the child's face was softer than it had been in 3 weeks. "Mr. Lee, the car is waiting in Zone F." His driver, Mr. Kim, had materialized at his elbow with that preternatural sense of timing that came from 15 years of service. Myung-seok was a man who paid for efficiency. He received it on demand. This was, he had always believed, how the world worked. But as he followed Mr. Kim toward the garage, Junha's small hand still wrapped around his jacket, Myung-seok found himself thinking about a woman who believed in small miracles, who had stood up from seat 42B when she didn't have to, who had recognized that a crisis of breathing was more important than propriety. His phone buzzed. A text from Han Yura, his secretary. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting. There are concerns about your absence. Of course there were. That was what the board did. It calculated. It measured his absence against projected losses. It prepared its questions and its exit strategies. Myung-seok's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. In another life, the life he'd been living before 3 weeks ago, he would have answered immediately, scheduling the meeting, framing his response, preparing his defense. But something small had shifted on that flight. Something about the sound of breathing, about a man realizing that control was an illusion maintained at great personal cost. He typed, "Provide details. I'll address the board next week." Next week, not tomorrow. Not in the urgent time frame that usually defined his existence. He would give himself permission for 5 more days with his grandson. 5 days to figure out what it meant to be a grandfather instead of a CEO. 5 days before the world insisted that these two identities were incompatible. The penthouse in Gangnam existed in a state of meticulous suspension. Everything had been cleaned 3 days before Myung-seok's arrival, the staff instructed to maintain absolute order. The floors gleamed. The refrigerator was stocked with appropriate foods. The child's room had been prepared with imported furniture selected from catalogs. A crib, a dresser, shelves waiting to be filled with the architecture of a boy's life that hadn't yet been decided. What the penthouse did not contain, Myung-seok discovered on the 3rd evening, was anything resembling comfort. Junha wouldn't sleep. The child had grown feverish with exhaustion, his small body rigid against the imported mattress, his eyes huge and glassy with the particular distress that comes when tiredness has gone so deep, it becomes pain. Myung-seok had called the pediatrician. The doctor, arriving with gratifying speed due to the financial arrangements, found nothing medically wrong. Grief insomnia, the doctor said, using the English term because he assumed it was more precise than Korean. Common in young children after trauma. The body refuses to surrender control, even to sleep. He needs routine, warmth, and... The doctor trailed off delicately. Maternal presence would be ideal. Myung-seok had nodded at this as if absorbing crucial information. But what he had understood, underneath, was that the doctor had just confirmed what he already knew. You are the wrong person for this job. He'd sat with Junha until midnight, then 2 a.m, the penthouse so silent it seemed to amplify the child's shallow breathing. At 3:47 a.m., Myung-seok had done what he did in all crises. He'd called someone qualified. Han-yura had arrived at the penthouse by 4:15 a.m., having left her husband with a vague excuse about a company emergency. In the soft hallway light, she'd assessed the situation with the kind of professional objectivity that had made her invaluable for the past 9 years. He needs consistency, she said, not looking at Junha. Not emotional volatility. A presence that is simply there, present. Not trying to fix or soothe, just being. That's not something I've ever been good at, Myung-seok said. No, Yura agreed. It wasn't cruelty, just fact. You've been trained in efficiency. This requires inefficiency. It requires sitting with discomfort and not attempting to resolve it. She spent the remainder of the night in the chair next to Junha's crib, knitting, of all things, a small blanket in gray yarn. The click, click, click of the needles created a rhythm. Not the rhythm of problem-solving or agenda management, but the rhythm of simple, repetitive presence. By dawn, Junha had finally succumbed to something resembling sleep. The next evening, Myung-seok asked Han-yura to stay again. She was, by her own admission, not qualified for childcare. Her own children were teenagers by now, and she'd had professional help for much of their upbringing. But she understood something that the imported pediatric specialist did not. The CEO needed to stop thinking of this as a problem to be solved and start thinking of it as a condition to be inhabited. You need to touch him more, she said on the 4th evening, after Junha had finally settled. Not as a manager manages, but just human contact. Brush his hair even if it doesn't need brushing. Hold his hand while he's eating. The human body heals from touch. I don't know how to do that, Myung-seok admitted. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in 9 years. You're a grandfather now, not a CEO. Those are different roles with different requirements. You weren't trained for grandfather. Nobody is. On the 7th day, 3 days after arriving in Seoul, Myung-seok took Junha to Namsan Park. The weather had held. No rain yet, just the gray promise of it. The park was filled with the soft peripheral life of a Seoul afternoon. Old women doing Tai Chi and practiced formation, young mothers navigating strollers, school children in uniform moving between academic destinations. It was also filled with the specific Seoul elite that constituted Myung-seok's actual world. He recognized Park Soo-hyun from SK Telecom at the playground, Jung Min-seo from the financial sector, the Daegu mayor's daughter sitting on a bench with a person who was clearly not her husband. None of them approached him. It wasn't cruelty. He commanded too much power for casual approach. Instead, they maintained the particular distance that acknowledged his presence without invading his space. The distance of equals who understood that some moments of weakness were to be witnessed privately, if at all. Junha, however, had no interest in wealth hierarchies. The child was fascinated by a young woman feeding pigeons near the temple grounds. She was unremarkable at first glance. Long dark hair, modest clothing, nothing that would catch the eye of a conglomerate CEO. But Junha had noticed something Myung-seok hadn't. She was using Vietnamese to coax the pigeons, and her hands moved with a tenderness that suggested she believed the birds could understand kindness. Nhung jua tren ho, she was saying. Small children, come, don't be afraid. Junha had toddled forward with the determination of a child who recognized that this woman spoke a language of gentleness. Myung-seok, moving to intercept, found himself apologizing to a stranger for his grandson's intrusion. It's fine, the woman said in Korean, smiling at Junha. Children understand things that adults forget. He's looking for softness. The simplicity of this observation struck Myung-seok as profound. She was right. His grandson was, in fact, looking for softness. Not explanation or resolution, or the orderly progression from grief to acceptance. Just softness. He would have continued this conversation, possibly even learned her name. But movement at the periphery of the park caught his attention. A figure in a light blue cotton blouse, moving with purpose toward the exit. Seraphine. The recognition was instantaneous and, for a moment, destabilizing. What were the odds? Seoul was a city of 10 million, and she had to have known, surely, that he lived here, that he worked here, that this park was in his neighborhood. Had she come looking for him? Mr. Lee? The Vietnamese woman was offering him a small bag of birdseed. For your grandson. Sometimes the small gestures are what we need. He took the bag without thinking, his attention still tracking the figure in blue. But by the time he could hand Junha to someone appropriate and make excuses, she had disappeared into the crowd at the gate. That evening, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He paid people to answer unknown numbers. But something made him pick up the call himself. Mr. Lee? I'm sorry to disturb you. This is Seraphine Holt. Your driver gave me this number. I think I have something that belongs to your grandson. His breath caught. You saw him, in the park. Yes. But that's not why I'm calling. When you left the plane in New York, Junha dropped something. A teddy bear. I picked it up thinking, well, I thought it might be important. I got it back to Seoul, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to return it. But then I saw you both today, and I realized I still have it. I wondered if... Where are you? Myung-seok asked. I'm at a cafe near the Hanok Bank building. Cafe Num. If that's not convenient, I'll come now. He didn't call for the driver. He told Han Yura he'd return within the hour and took himself down to the car. Junha was already asleep in the penthouse, and Mrs. Park, the housekeeper who had been there since his son's childhood, would watch him. This was purely about the teddy bear. This was not about the woman from 42B at all. Café Num was exactly the kind of establishment that made Seoul peculiar and magnetic. It was small, unpretentious, built on the premise that coffee was secondary to the space created around the coffee. Records played on an old turntable. Books lined the walls, organized by size rather than subject. The lighting was warm and entirely insufficient for any practical purpose. It was, in other words, the opposite of every space Myung-seok usually inhabited. Seraphine was sitting in the corner, the teddy bear, worn, yellow, with one eye slightly looser than the other, resting beside her on the table. When she saw him, she stood up, again with that warmth that seemed entirely unrehearsed. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know it's probably..." She paused. "Actually, I know nothing about what it probably is. I've learned that assuming about people based on their position is usually wrong." "Sit," Myung-seok said, and it came out as a command. He softened it slightly. "Please." The barista delivered his coffee without him ordering. They must have known who he was, or simply anticipated the needs of the man now sitting across from her. Seraphine had chamomile tea in a glass with a metal filter. Everything about her continued to be this way. Unpretentious, considered, existing according to principles Myung-seok couldn't quite identify. "You came back to Seoul," he said. "I lived here. I told you on the plane. You were leaving." She set down her tea carefully. "You're quite perceptive." "Yes. I was going to New York for meetings that were actually job interviews. My visa was ending anyway. I thought it was time to..." She gestured vaguely. "Move on." Seoul had been good, but I'd been here long enough to know that some things weren't going to happen for me here. "What things?" She smiled slightly. "Peace, maybe. Understanding. A place where my presence didn't require explanation. And now? Now I don't know. I went to the meetings. The job offers were good. One was excellent, actually. But when I was supposed to take the flight back to Seoul to wrap things up, something made me take a flight to New York instead. I spent another week there, stayed with friends, did a lot of thinking. And then I thought about that boy on the plane, and I thought about his grandfather, who had the face of someone carrying the entire world. And I thought, maybe I should see if they landed okay. So you came back to Seoul. So I came back to Seoul." Myung-seok reached across the small table and took the teddy bear. It was soft in a way that suggested it had been loved extensively. The eye that was loose seemed to look at him with sympathy, which was probably a reflection of his own psychology. "He's been asking for this," Myung-seok said. "Every night. I didn't understand what he meant. He was too tired to communicate. He just kept saying friend in Korean. I thought he meant a person." "How is he?" Seraphine asked. "He doesn't sleep. The doctor says it's grief insomnia. I don't know how to help him." "You're here," Seraphine said simply. "That's help." "It's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It's probably not. But you'll figure out what more is needed. You seem like someone who, once he understands something matters, he reorganizes his entire existence to accommodate it." She had assessed him, this woman from Washington, D.C., with the leaf necklace and the hands that knew how to soothe crying babies. And her assessment was, Myung-seok suspected, accurate in ways that made him uncomfortable. "I should get back," he said. But he didn't move. "Before they wake up and find I'm gone." "Of course." She stood, and he realized she'd probably been expecting him to leave quickly, to confirm that their connection was temporary, that she'd simply been a brief miracle on a flight, and now they were returning to their actual lives. But as he stood to leave, He heard himself say, "Do you have time tomorrow? In the afternoon? My grandson would probably like to thank you properly." He watched her process this. Watched her consider whether it was advisable, whether it might create complications, whether it was the right thing to accept. And then she said, "Yes, I have time." Seraphine arrived at the penthouse at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, with the kind of punctuality that suggested she'd planned the trajectory of her day around the specific moment of arrival. She wore a lightweight sweater despite the cold, and carried a small paper bag that smelled like fresh bread and something sweet. "I wasn't sure what a 2-year-old eats," she said, handing the bag to Han Yura, who had greeted her at the door with the professional neutrality of someone whose job was to assess whether this visitor would create complications or solve them. "So I brought a few options." Han Yura, who had worked in corporate environments long enough to understand that Seraphine represented either the best or worst possible outcome for her employer, accepted the bag with a nod that contained no judgment. Junha was in the living room, sitting on the marble floor among toys that looked like they'd been selected from a catalog of appropriate developmental engagement. He froze when he saw Seraphine, his entire body seeming to ask, "Is this real, or did I dream you?" "The breathing lady," he whispered in Korean. "That's me," she confirmed, settling down on the marble floor with no concern for the cost of her sweater. "I brought your friend back." She produced the teddy bear with the gravity of someone revealing a priceless artifact. Junha's face transformed, the corners of his mouth lifting in what Myung-seok realized, with a small shock, was genuine joy. The child had not smiled since arriving in Seoul. He had cried, he had been quiet, but he had not until this moment smiled. Junha launched himself across the marble floor with the determination of a small, enthusiastic missile, and Seraphine caught him with the ease of someone who'd done this many times. She pulled him close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, a gesture so natural it seemed to come from the bone level of her being. Myung-seok found himself watching this with an intensity that bordered on fixation. "Would you like to have lunch?" he heard himself ask. They sat in the dining room, which was a mistake because it was designed for the kind of formal corporate meals where profit margins were discussed instead of joy, and ate from the paper bag Seraphine had brought. Fresh bingsu, little cakes that tasted like bergamot and butter. She'd bought food from a cafe that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was, and it transformed the marble table into something that resembled a home instead of a showroom. Junha sat between Seraphine and Myung-seok, his small feet swinging, his mouth perpetually occupied with sweets that were probably not approved by any pediatric nutritionist. At one point, he leaned against Seraphine's shoulder and told her, in the fragmented syntax of a toddler, that he'd had a dream about flying. "That sounds amazing," she said. "What were you flying to?" "The clouds," Junha said seriously. "To find the lady with the breathing, to say thank you." Seraphine looked at Myung-seok across the table. Her eyes were the kind of brown that contained complexity. Not simple warmth, but something more textured with lived experience. "I think he found me," she said. "So thank you isn't necessary." "In Korea," Myung-seok said, "we believe deeply in gratitude, in the obligation to acknowledge when someone has done something significant." "And in America," Seraphine replied, not unkindly, "we believe that kindness shouldn't require calculation of debt. It should just be given. That's the difference between a transaction and an act of grace." She was challenging him, this woman. Not aggressively, but definitively. And Myung-seok found that he liked it. After lunch, Junha showed her the penthouse with the kind of pride that suggested he'd already begun to identify it as home, despite the marble coldness of its aesthetic. He led her to his room, where the imported furniture looked even more sterile when he was demonstrating them. And then to what he clearly considered the most important location. A small balcony on the south-facing side, where an older woman was tending to a collection of potted plants, My grandmother, Seraphine guessed, seeing the woman in the distance across the neighbor's garden-level space. No, Myung-seok said. Actually, I'm not sure what her role is. She's been here since my son's childhood. The house has her more than I do. They stepped out onto the balcony, and the woman, Mrs. Park, looked up from her pruning with the expression of someone who'd seen everything and judged most of it. But when she saw Seraphine, something shifted in her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was a slight softening of the professional mask. New friend of Mr. Lee? She asked in Korean. This is Seraphine Holt, Myung-seok said formally. She helped my grandson on the airplane. Mrs. Park nodded slowly, as if this explained something she'd been wondering. Come, she said to Seraphine. Help me with plants. You know plants? And just like that, Seraphine was pulled into the small world of Mrs. Park's garden, where herbs grew in clay pots and mint smelled like memory, and the woman was explaining in rapid-fire Korean which plants would survive Seoul's winter and which were already dying from Myung-seok's neglect. He works all the time, Mrs. Park was saying, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. No time for living things. The plants know this. They tell me through their leaves. Myung-seok watched Seraphine respond to this without skepticism, asking questions about soil and water and the specific conditions that would make each plant flourish. She was touching the plants with a tenderness that suggested she believed, as Mrs. Park apparently believed, that objects of life deserved attention and intention. Junha had fallen asleep against Seraphine's leg, his small body lax with a contentment that Myung-seok hadn't witnessed since before his parents' accident. The child was using her leg as a pillow and his teddy bear as a life raft, the kind of comfort that came from trusting that you wouldn't be abandoned if you surrendered to sleep. How long are you staying in Seoul? Myung-seok asked quietly. I haven't decided, Seraphine said, deadheading a flower with the focus of someone who was learning the craft in real time. I quit my job. Or rather, I told them I needed to think about whether I wanted the job. They weren't thrilled, but they understood that sometimes people need to pause and figure out what they actually want, as opposed to what they're supposed to want. What do you want? She was quiet for a long moment, her hands continuing their work with the plants, as if the work required all her attention. I want to help children who've experienced loss, she said finally. I want to live somewhere that I'm not always explaining or apologizing for my existence. I want to wake up without the weight of all the things I've failed to accomplish. And I want... She paused. This is probably too honest. Tell me. I want to know if there are people in the world who see you and don't expect you to be powerful, who just want you to be present. Myung-seok understood in that moment that Seraphine wasn't talking about what she wanted from the universe in general. She was articulating what she wanted from him, or perhaps what she was already offering, the option to be something other than the CEO, the option to simply be a man holding his grandson's grief. I think I would like to provide that for you, he said quietly, if you'll stay. She looked at him then, and her expression contained a complexity that no amount of corporate training could have prepared him for. It was hope and fear and the recognition that sometimes the most dangerous decisions are the ones that involve trusting someone to see you clearly and continue loving you anyway. I'm terrified, she said. So am I, Myung-seok replied. And so Seraphine stayed. She stayed because Mrs. Park had decided, apparently, that the plants required her supervision. She stayed because Junha woke from his nap asking if she was still there. She stayed because Myung-seok asked her, with a directness that suggested someone learning to speak without the filter of corporate diplomacy, to come back tomorrow. She stayed because sometimes love arrives not as lightning but as dawn, gradual, warming the world incrementally until you realize you're already transformed. It snowed for the first time that season 3 days later. Seoul transformed overnight into the kind of city that appears in postcards and winter cinema, softened, muffled, rendered almost gentle by the weight of white. The penthouse balcony became a landscape of potential, and Myung-seok found himself standing there at 6 a.m., watching the snow fall and thinking about how many mornings he'd missed, because they were simply background to more important things. His phone had buzzed 47 times during the night. Board meeting agendas, investment reports, a text from Chairman Park regarding quarterly projections. The empire was a living thing that required feeding, and his absence was creating ripples that would soon become waves. He ignored all of it. Seraphine had moved into a small guest room, at Han Yura's suggestion, who understood that perception mattered less than reality. And Seraphine's reality was now simply a woman who came at 10 a.m. and left at 10 p.m., and was slowly becoming someone he couldn't imagine the house existing without. They'd developed a rhythm that resembled what Myung-seok imagined families did, if he'd grown up in a family instead of in a boarding school and a series of corporate offices. They took Junha to parks. They sat in small cafes. They rode the subway on a Tuesday afternoon, just to understand what Seoul felt like to someone who wasn't viewing it from the perspective of a penthouse or a private car. This morning, before she arrived, Myung-seok had texted her, "Snow. Can Junha see it?" Her response, "Yes. Nothing in the world should be missed." So when she arrived at 9:30 a.m., earlier than usual, and without waiting for invitation, she was already dressed in layers, with Junha's small snow boots already purchased and waiting by the door. Seraphine had been shopping. For them. The intimacy of this action, her assuming they would go outside, her taking steps to ensure his comfort, registered with a softness that made Myung-seok almost unable to function in his own home. "You bought him boots," he said. "He needed boots," Seraphine replied simply. "You can't experience snow properly without appropriate footwear." And so they ventured into Seoul's snow-covered streets with a 2-year-old, and the kind of wonder that Myung-seok hadn't felt since childhood. Junha had never properly experienced snow before. Korea had winters, but his first 2 years had been spent in Washington, D.C., where snow came differently and hit the ground with less grace. This was his first Seoul snow. His first experience of the kind of whiteness that transformed even the most brutal urban landscape into something almost sacred. The child stood in the middle of a pedestrian walkway, while Seraphine ensured no cars were coming, and simply wept with joy at the small miracle of a snowflake landing on his tiny gloved hand. They found a cafe. Small, warm, the kind of place that existed in the margins of Seoul's commerce. Hot chocolate for Junha, coffee for Myung-seok, tea for Seraphine. The snow continued outside the window, and the world contracted into this single room where 3 people who barely knew each other were learning to be together. "Tell me about your family," Seraphine asked. "I mean before the accident." Myung-seok didn't usually speak about this, didn't usually crack open the private spaces where he kept the things that mattered most. But she was asking not with the curiosity of someone cataloging his weaknesses, but with the genuine desire to understand the architecture of his grief. "My son was named Min-jun," he said carefully. "He was different from me, warmer, better at connection. He lived in D.C. because his wife is American, which caused significant friction with my own ex-wife. She believed he was abandoning his heritage. I believed he was choosing his own life, which was something I never felt permitted to do." He paused, watching the snow accumulate on the cafe window. He worked in technology, but he didn't care about advancing the company. He only cared about the work itself, the puzzle of it. He had Junha, and he was... Myung-seok's voice softened. "He was the kind of father I never learned how to be. He was present. He came home at 5 p.m. because he wanted to. He played on the floor. He sang to his son. He was everything I was told was irrelevant, and he was happier than I've ever been." And then, And then a car hit him while he was crossing the street. His wife was in the car too. They were coming home from Junha's pediatrician appointment. The appointment happened at 4 p.m. If it had been at 3 p.m. or 5 p.m., the timing would have been different. If the driver had been earlier or later, if they'd taken a different route. The variables are endless, and none of them matter now because they happened the way they happened. He looked directly at Seraphine. How is a person supposed to recover from the understanding that the things he valued didn't matter, and the life he thought was irrelevant apparently was the only thing worth living? Seraphine set down her tea. "My brother died when I was 19, she said quietly. He was a counselor at a summer camp. He was helping a camper who was struggling with depression, and that camper, well, he had access to his parents' gun collection. David was trying to talk him down, and the gun went off. It was ruled an accident, but the technicalities didn't matter. My brother was dead because he cared too much about someone who was suffering. Junha had fallen asleep in his seat, his small body lax against the cafe chair. My mother told me that his death proved that caring was dangerous, that the safest way to live was to be indifferent, to keep yourself closed, to not let other people's pain become your problem. So I spent years being careful about what I felt. I dated men who were safe, cold, mostly. I took jobs that paid well but meant nothing. I was very good at being protected. And now I'm 46 years old, and I realize that I've become very good at being lonely. So I quit everything. I came to Seoul to start an NGO, because I thought if I helped children, if I lived with purpose again, it would be enough to fill the space my brother left. But it wasn't enough. I was still doing it all from behind a wall. She looked at Junha, sleeping peacefully. Then I was on an airplane, and a child was screaming, and I realized that I could either sit with that pain, or I could keep pretending that protection is the same thing as living. I chose to sit with it, and everything started to change. Myung-seok reached across the small table and took her hand. It was such a simple gesture, two people connecting physically, but in the context of his life, it felt revolutionary. In the context of his childhood, his marriages, his entire professional existence, this was a gesture of genuine vulnerability. "I'm changing too," he said. "I'm not sure how to be a different person, but I'm trying because my grandson is looking at me and asking me to be better than I am." "You're already better," Seraphine said. "You're just not the version you've always been." They stayed in the cafe until the snow stopped falling, and the afternoon light began its descent into evening. Junha woke and demanded more hot chocolate. Seraphine taught him to count snowflakes visible through the window, a task that was both impossible and completely absorbing. Myung-seok watched the two of them together and understood, with a clarity that couldn't be rationalized away, that his life was now divided into before this woman and after. When they left the cafe, Seraphine's hand remained in his. And for the first time in years, possibly for the first time in his life, Myung-seok allowed himself to believe that change was not just possible, but already happening. The NGO where Seraphine worked was located in a restored hanok house in Bucheon, the kind of historically preserved neighborhood that Seoul had kept like a pressed flower. Beautiful, but somewhat removed from the city's actual functioning. The organization, which was called Begin Again, served refugee and immigrant families, particularly those navigating the challenge of early childhood development in a language and culture not their own. Myung-seok, on the insistence of Han Yura, who had begun to operate on the assumption that what would stabilize the CEO was actual presence rather than corporate discipline, had arranged to visit the facility on a Thursday afternoon. This required explanation, which Han Yura provided to the board via email. Mr. Lee is consulting regarding potential philanthropic opportunities. His presence supports the company's community engagement objectives, which was, technically, true. Though the actual objective was simpler. Myung-seok was terrified that Seraphine's world was separate from his, that the person she was when working with children and families was a different version than the one who held his hand in the snow. Corporate life had taught him that people were compartmentalized, that the man who managed billion-dollar investments was different than the man who loved his son, different than the man capable of guilt, different than the man now learning to be present to a child's grief. He was afraid that Seraphine would turn out to be the same. When he walked into the Begin Again office, clutching Junha's hand, with Han Yura awkwardly present as official chaperone, he found Seraphine in a large room filled with children. Vietnamese, Somali, Filipino, Thai. A diversity of humanity that probably didn't exist in Myung-seok's corporate meetings in the year that led up to this moment. And Seraphine was moving through the room with a presence that made all of them, the children, their parents who'd accompanied them, the other staff members, track her movement as if she were a source of light. She was teaching them to sing. It wasn't a lesson precisely. It was more like the singing was a pretext for something else. Connection, maybe. Or the experience of being part of something larger than individual pain. The song was in English, but she sang it in multiple languages, teaching each group the phrases in their own tongue, so that the room became this beautiful chaos of overlapping sounds. "This is my favorite part of the work," she said to Myung-seok, once the singing had finished and the children had dispersed to other activities. "This right here. When someone who doesn't know anything about singing realizes that their voice matters, that they have something to contribute, that they're part of something. You're very good at this," he said. And it wasn't a compliment designed to flatter. It was observation. "I love it," she corrected. "I'm just present while doing it. The love makes it good." She took him through the facility, introducing him to staff members who clearly adored her, introducing him to children who treated him with the kind of respectful confusion that came from not quite understanding who he was in the context of their own lives. Junha became absorbed into the play happening in the arts room, painting something that resembled abstract expressionism, or possibly just the experience of having access to color for the first time. In a small office, somehow simultaneously cluttered and organized, Seraphine introduced him to Eun-hae, the director of Begin Again, who regarded Myung-seok with the kind of careful assessment that suggested she'd been briefed but wanted to arrive at her own conclusions. "Seraphine says you've reorganized your schedule to accommodate her work," Eun-hae said in English. "This is surprising. From what I know of the CEO of LS International Group, schedule reorganization is not typical." "Things change," Myung-seok said simply. "Priorities shift." "Do they?" Eun-hae leaned back in her chair. "I've watched many wealthy men pass through organizations like this. They give money because it makes them feel good, or because it relieves them of guilt, or because their PR team requires it, but they don't change their schedules. They don't bring their grandsons to sit in our arts room. They don't watch someone the way you watch Seraphine." Myung-seok didn't defend himself because there was nothing to defend. She was right. "I think," Eun-hae continued, "that perhaps you came here expecting to understand how Seraphine was different from the version of herself you've already known. And you're discovering that she isn't different. She's just consistent. The person with you in the snow is the same person singing with children in Bukchon. This probably frightens you, because consistency requires genuine change instead of performance." "I don't know who I am in this version," Myung-seok admitted. "Then you're in exactly the right place to find out," Eun-hae said, not unkindly. "We spend all day helping people begin again. You might as well be one of them." When they left the facility, the snow was falling again. Different than the morning snow, more tentative, as if it weren't entirely sure of its commitment to Seoul's winter. Junha held a painting he'd made, a thing of pure color that probably wouldn't survive a week of handling. But the child treated it like an artifact of tremendous importance, and no one had the heart to inform him otherwise. "I'm falling in love with you," Myung-seok said, and the statement came out so plainly, it took both of them by surprise. "I'm not supposed to. It's inconvenient and complicated and probably a terrible idea." but I am." Seraphine stopped walking. The snow continued falling around them, and somewhere in the city, sirens announced someone's emergency. Seoul continued its particular chaos, but in this small pocket of space, there was a man finally learning to speak the truth, and a woman who'd come back to Seoul specifically because she couldn't not. "I came back to Seoul because I couldn't stay away," she said. "I told myself it was about finishing projects at the NGO. I told myself I wanted to see if Junha was okay. But the real reason was that sitting on an airplane, holding your grandson, I realized that my entire approach to safety was wrong, that I'd been protecting myself from the exact thing I actually needed. I didn't know you before that flight, but I knew something in those moments. Something about who you could become if someone gave you permission to stop performing." She took his hand. Junha, between them, reached up and grabbed both of their hands, creating a small triangle of connection. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said, "and I'm also terrified. But the terror feels like proof that it's real." The board meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room so aggressively climate-controlled that it felt like a space designed by someone who believed emotion should be literally frozen out. Myung-seok hadn't attended a meeting in 3 weeks. 3 weeks had been enough time for Chairman Park Ji-hwan to consolidate power, to call in favors, to prepare his case for why the company required a CEO who prioritized the corporation instead of personal entanglements. Myung-seok's absence had been interpreted, as he'd anticipated, as weakness. "The quarterly projections have suffered," Park said, in the tone of someone presenting facts that couldn't be disputed. "The Shanghai expansion has stalled. The media division is showing marginal returns, and this is all while our CEO is, what, practicing emotional growth?" The other board members didn't smile, but the implication was clear. They were uncomfortable, which meant they might be persuadable. "The company requires decisive leadership," Park continued, gesturing toward the quarterly reports now distributed. "Not someone who disappears to play grandfather while the empire crumbles." "The company is fine," Myung-seok said, his voice steady in a way that came from the previous 30 years of controlling rooms. "Quarterly fluctuations are normal. The Shanghai expansion will resume. These numbers don't reflect decline. They reflect recalibration." "Recalibration?" Park's smile was sharp. "Is that what we're calling it? Because the shareholders are calling it abandonment." "I've been here for 30 years, Myung-seok said. "I think I've earned the right to take 6 weeks for family matters. My work during those 30 years has built enough stability that the company survives without me for a month. And in another month?" Park leaned forward. "What else will require your attention? What other personal matters will take priority over the company? And when will you finally decide that running a technology conglomerate requires more than good intentions and—" He paused delicately. "Emotional projects?" The silence in the room was profound. "I think," Chairman Park continued, "that the board should consider whether Mr. Lee is still capable of leading LS International. His judgment has clearly been compromised." Myung-seok didn't stand up. He didn't lose control. He simply looked at the man who'd been positioning against him for years and understood that this wasn't about corporate performance. It was about the specific shame that powerful men feel when other powerful men choose to be vulnerable. "I'm prepared to offer my resignation," Myung-seok said quietly. The room fractured into shock. "However," he continued, "I would do so only if the board can accurately articulate why my personal choices represent a liability to the company's financial performance. Not my absence, because my absence has been compensated for through existing management structures. Not my emotional well-being, because my well-being is my own concern, but the specific correlation between my private life and shareholder decline." He looked directly at Park. "Can you do that?" "Your credibility is destroyed," Park said. "My credibility with whom?" Myung-seok asked. "With men like you? Men who've been taught that humanity is weakness?" I'm okay with losing that credibility. What I'm not okay with is allowing you to frame personal growth as corporate malfeasance." He stood, and the gesture had such finality that the other board members, sensing that something fundamental was shifting, began to pay closer attention. "I'll take a 6-month leave," Myung-seok said. "The company can be managed by the current executive structure. My deputy CEO has been prepared for expanded responsibility. If after 6 months the company hasn't stabilized, the board can move forward with replacing me. But I won't apologize for the fact that my grandson needed me, and I was present for that need. I won't apologize for finding someone who teaches me that power and love aren't mutually exclusive. And I won't apologize to men who are afraid that my choices might suggest alternatives to their own." He walked out of the boardroom before anyone could respond, and the gesture would be reported in the following weeks as either a resignation or an assertion of power, depending on which journalist you asked. Han-yura followed him into the hallway. "That was reckless," she said, not accusingly but factually. "Probably. You might have just handed Park the company. Possibly. And you're okay with that?" Myung-seok thought about Junha's small hand in his, about the sound of Seraphine's voice teaching children to sing, about a morning where he'd chosen to watch snow instead of analyze financial projections. "Yes," he said finally. "I am." The headline appeared in the Korea Economic Daily. The following morning, LS International CEO takes 6-month leave as board questions company direction. By afternoon, the more aggressive outlets had expanded. Power play or personal crisis? What's really behind Lee Myung-seok's disappearance? By evening, Dispatch, the Korean celebrity news outlet that functioned more as a weaponized paparazzi organization, had done what Myung-seok had been anticipating with the kind of resignation that comes from having lived in a surveillance state long enough to know that privacy was a myth maintained by people with money. They'd found Seraphine. The photograph was taken in Bukchon, outside the Begin Again facility, and it showed them holding hands. It was innocuous by any reasonable standard. 2 adults, physical contact, nothing inappropriate. But in the context of a CEO who just pulled himself from power, it became a narrative. Who is the American woman who captured Lee Myung-seok's heart? Sources say she's from DC, age 46, profession unknown. Seraphine called him that evening. Her voice was steady, but underneath was the tremor of someone processing the collision between private life and public scrutiny. "They found out my name," she said. "The article will probably update soon. There's already speculation about my background, my visa status, my intentions." "I'm sorry," Myung-seok said, and it felt inadequate. "Don't apologize for caring about someone. Let them speculate. Let them be confused. Their confusion is their problem, not ours." But he could hear what she wasn't saying. That this was Seoul. That foreigners, particularly foreign women with foreign ideas, were perpetually suspect. That her presence in his life would be interpreted as not just romantic interest, but potentially as corrupting influence, cultural dilution. The specific anxiety that Korea often harbored about its identity being invaded by Western ideas. By the next morning, the Korea Times had published a more sympathetic piece. "The long loneliness of corporate power, a CEO rediscovers humanity." But alongside it was a conservative blog questioning whether a CEO having a relationship with a foreign woman was appropriate, given his obligations to the company. The board, perhaps predictably, circled. Park called for an emergency meeting to discuss Myung-seok's compromised judgment in matters of personal conduct. This time, the language shifted. They weren't just questioning his business decisions. They were questioning his fitness as a representative of Korean corporate values. And this was where the real danger lived. Not in the company structure. Myung-seok's deputy CEO was stable. The company was stable, but in the cultural narrative. Because in Korea, a CEO's personal choices reflected on the corporation, with an intensity that Western markets didn't typically demand. A woman from outside the culture, from outside the race, from outside the designated hierarchy. This was more than romantic interest. This was, in the minds of the board, a choice against Korean values. Myung-seok read the email from Park and understood that he was being given an ultimatum, wrapped in the language of company concern. Mr. Lee, the board remains committed to your leadership, provided you recommit to corporate focus and cease the behavior that's created negative media attention. Public image affects shareholder confidence. We trust you'll make the correct choice. Which was to say, end the relationship or end your career. He'd known, on some level, that this would come. That Seraphine had known it would come. That the brief period of grace they'd been allowed, the snow, the singing, the slow building of something that felt like family, had an expiration date written into Korean corporate culture. He was supposed to choose the company. That was the expected narrative. That was what every previous version of Myung-seok would have chosen. But previous versions of Myung-seok were versions that had watched his son die without ever having told him that he was proud. Without ever having admitted that Min-jun's warmth was more important than his stock portfolio contributions. Without ever having held his grandson, while the child cried from grief that the grandfather couldn't fix, but could at least bear witness to. So Myung-seok made a choice that contradicted everything he'd been built to understand about power and priority. He called Seraphine and asked her to marry him. The announcement came on a Friday, not through the company, but through a press conference held at a small cafe in Bukchon, 10 meters from the Begin Again facility. Myung-seok stood with Junha on his hip and Seraphine beside him, and he spoke to the assembled journalists with a clarity that suggested someone who'd finally aligned his external life with his internal reality. I have decided to step down as CEO of LS International Group effective immediately, he began. This decision is not the result of pressure from the board or the company. It is a choice I am making after careful consideration of my personal values and my professional capabilities. The company will transition to Deputy CEO Park Min-ho, who I believe is exceptionally qualified to manage the organization through the coming quarters. There was silence as journalists absorbed this development. I have also this morning asked Seraphine Holt to marry me, he continued, and at this, Seraphine's hand moved to rest on his shoulder. She has accepted. We will be having a wedding ceremony here in Seoul, and we will be raising my grandson together as a family. I am aware that my personal choices have generated commentary about cultural values and appropriate behavior for a CEO. I want to be clear. I do not believe that love is inappropriate. I do not believe that choosing a partner based on genuine connection represents a failure of Korean identity. I believe that it represents a choice to prioritize the actual substance of my life over the performance of corporate expectations. He looked directly at the cameras, at the journalists, at the public, at his family watching this from a distance. I spent 52 years building an empire that told me I was successful. I built it at the cost of my relationship with my own son. I was not present when he needed me because I was busy protecting something I thought mattered more. My son is dead now, and I cannot change those choices, but I can change my choices going forward. I can be present to my grandson's grief. I can choose a woman I love without calculating the corporate implications. I can choose to live instead of perform. And I can admit, publicly and without reservation, that the greatest strength isn't in control. It's in the willingness to surrender that control when something real is at stake. He concluded with what might have been the first genuinely honest statement of his entire public career. If the price of my happiness is the judgment of people who've confused corporate loyalty with human meaning, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. I hope you'll wish us well. And then he stepped away from the microphone and held his family, his grandson, his fiancée, his rebuilt life. As the journalists shouted questions he had no intention of answering. The falling out from the announcement was profound and multifaceted. The company's stock dropped 3.2% in the afternoon trading, a decline that suggested investor nervousness about leadership transition, but nothing catastrophic. More damaging was the cultural conversation. News cycles filled with commentary about the appropriateness of his choice, the Korean perspective on his resignation, the danger of allowing foreign influence to disrupt corporate tradition. Conservative politicians quoted his resignation as evidence of cultural degradation. Feminist writers celebrated it as evidence of men learning accountability. And in the middle of all of this, Myung-seok and Seraphine inhabited a strange, suspended space where their happiness existed alongside constant explanation. It was Han Yura who finally brought him the letter. She appeared at the penthouse on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the press conference, holding a sealed envelope in her steady hands. "Your ex-wife," she said simply. "She sent this to the office. I thought you should see it." Myung-seok opened the envelope with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something that might shatter him. Inside was handwriting he didn't recognize. His ex-wife's had become cramped and sharp after their divorce, but this was almost calligraphic, as if the writer had spent enormous time deciding how to form each letter. Myung-seok, I watched your press conference. I watched you stand in front of cameras and speak about values that I tried to teach you for 15 years, and you rejected because they didn't align with profit margins. I am angry about this. I am angry that it took losing Min-jun to wake you up to what actually matters. But I am also, underneath the anger, relieved. Jun-ha was starting to be raised by someone who thought love was a distraction. That would have been a tragedy. Instead, he's being raised by someone who's learning that love is the only thing that matters. I don't know your Seraphine, but I watched the way she looked at your grandson in that photograph. That's not opportunism. That's someone who understands what Min-jun always understood, that people matter more than everything else. I'm writing because I want you to know that I'm not unsurprised by your choice, but I'm proud of it in a way that I wasn't proud of the empire. Min-jun would be proud too. He always said his father had a good heart that got crushed under the weight of expectation. Maybe Seraphine is what it took to let that heart breathe again. Jun-ha should grow up knowing about his parents. I'm writing this down for you to share with him. Stories, photographs, the specific things that made Min-jun and Soo-jin who they were. They loved each other genuinely, without performance. They loved their son, without calculating his future contributions. That's the legacy that matters, not the company. That. Them. The love. Congratulations on your wedding. I hope it's filled with the kind of joy that corporate success never provided. Your former wife, Ji-ho. Myung-seok read the letter 3 times, and on the 3rd reading, he began to cry. Not the controlled tears he'd allowed himself since his son's death, but actual bodily tears that required him to sit down. Han Yura, who was still present, simply placed a hand on his shoulder and remained quiet, understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is witnessing someone's grief without attempting to fix it. The wedding happened in spring, 6 weeks after Myung-seok's resignation, in a garden in Suwon that had been selected specifically because it was neither a corporate venue nor a traditional Korean wedding hall, but rather a small garden that Seraphine had discovered while walking, which belonged to an elderly couple who were charmed enough by the romantic nature of the request to agree to host the ceremony. There were 53 guests, a surprisingly small number for someone of Myung-seok's previous prominence, but precisely the right size for this version of his life. His ex-wife attended, which scandalized some and vindicated others. Seraphine's colleagues from Begin Again came, filling the space with the particular joy that comes from people who found professional meaning. Jun-ha, dressed in a small suit that he kept trying to remove, served as ring-bearer with the kind of seriousness that suggested he understood, on some cellular level, that this was important. The ceremony was held in the late afternoon, with light that had that specific quality of spring. warm but not yet summer, full of the promise of things beginning again. Seraphine wore a dress that was white, but not aggressively so, and traditional, but not rigidly so. A compromise between cultures that reflected exactly who she was, present to both, fully committed to neither in the way that required erasing her own identity. Myung-seok, watching her walk toward him, felt something click into place that had been misaligned for his entire life. This wasn't what success looked like. This wasn't what he'd been trained to expect from happiness. But it was real, and it was his. And he was choosing it with a consciousness that made the choice matter. The vows they'd written themselves were simple and genuine. Seraphine, I came to Seoul to end something, and instead I found a beginning. I promise to build this with you not because it's easy, or because it makes sense by the standards of the world we've inherited, but because you matter to me. Because Junha matters to me. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can do is choose love when everything else tells us to be afraid. Myung-seok, I spent my life building the wrong things. I built walls where I should have built bridges. I built empires where I should have built homes. You showed me that there's another way to exist, that power and tenderness aren't opposites but can, in fact, be the same thing. I promise to spend the rest of my life building with you for Junha, a home that prioritizes the things that actually matter. Not because it's what I've been trained to do, but because you've taught me that this is what life actually is. They kissed, and somewhere in the garden, a child laughed. Junha, who'd finally freed himself from his suit jacket and was running through the grass with the kind of unself-conscious joy that suggested the ground had shifted. He had a mother figure now. More importantly, he had a grandfather learning to be present. They didn't stay in the penthouse. That space had too many echoes of the old Myung-seok, and while he wasn't entirely escaped from him, the house that existed in Seraphine's imagination was something else entirely. They found it in Seongbuk-dong, a small neighborhood in northern Seoul that managed to be both accessible and removed from the main current of the city. It was an older hanok that had been carefully renovated, not modernized into glass and steel like the penthouse, but rather restored to what it was always meant to be. Wooden floors, a courtyard, rooms that existed for specific purposes instead of vague luxury. Seraphine called it the house with space for breathing. Myung-seok called it the house where we'll tell Junha about his parents. They commissioned a photographer to capture images of Min-jun and Soo-jin, some from Myung-seok's private collections, others provided by Min-jun's friends who understood that memory was more important than privacy. They created a space in the courtyard, accessible but not aggressively so, where Junha could see them as his comprehension developed. He'll ask why they're gone, Seraphine said, on an evening when they were arranging the photographs. Yes, Myung-seok agreed. And we'll tell him the truth. We'll tell him they loved him very much, and that accidents happen that no amount of money or power can prevent. We'll tell him that his job is to live fully because they can't. And we'll tell him that he has us, and that having us isn't a replacement, but rather a different kind of continuation. It's a lot for a small child to process. Yes, but children are more capable of processing truth than we give them credit for. It's the lies that destroy us. Mrs. Park arrived one afternoon with a collection of plants from the penthouse, announcing that they would develop a proper garden instead of whatever sad flowers in desperate containers Seraphine had apparently purchased. She'd taken to Seraphine with the kind of fierce loyalty that suggested the housekeeper had been waiting years for someone who would finally treat her as essential instead of peripheral. Junha started attending a preschool in the neighborhood, not the expensive international school that Myung-seok had initially selected, but rather a small program run by parents who believed in play-based learning and cultural integration. He made friends. Korean friends. Children of small business owners and teachers, and people who worked ordinary jobs. He learned to navigate the world in a way that transcended the hierarchies Myung-seok had been born into. The company, under Deputy CEO Park Min-ho's guidance, stabilized. It didn't grow at the previous rate, a fact that some analysts interpreted as decline, and others understood as the natural result of a company no longer being run by someone desperate to prove something through quarterly returns. Shareholder value remained relatively consistent. The culture slowly shifted toward what had always been possible, but never prioritized. A workplace where people worked because their skills were valued, not because they were afraid. Myung-seok didn't return to the company. He didn't miss it, which surprised him. Instead, he spent his time with Seraphine, deepening the work at Begin Again, which had received a significant financial contribution from someone who understood that healing children required resources. He spent time with Junha, teaching him the language that would help him navigate both his grandfather's heritage and his mother's. He spent time simply being present in a way that his entire previous existence had trained him against. 1 year into their new life, during a spring evening in the garden of the hanok, Myung-seok realized that he'd finally learned what his son had always understood, that presence was not a loss of power. It was the only real power that mattered. A year after the wedding, on a morning when spring had turned into early summer, and the garden was alive with the specific green of things that had been carefully tended, Myung-seok sat with his grandson in the courtyard and told him about his parents. Junha, now 3 years old and capable of understanding certain types of concepts, listened with the kind of intense concentration that toddlers bring to important information. "Your appa and your umma loved each other very much," Myung-seok said. "And they loved you more than they loved anything else in the world." "Where did they go?" Junha asked, already knowing the answer, but needing it confirmed in a way that would help him reorganize it in his understanding. "They had an accident, a car accident, and their bodies couldn't keep working after that. But the important part, the part that loved you, that doesn't disappear. Will you have an accident?" The question was simple and absolutely devastating in its specificity. "I might," Myung-seok said, not sugarcoating the fact. "Everyone might because accidents happen. But I'm going to be very careful to be here for you while I am here. And when I'm not here, you'll have other people. You'll have Halmione." He gestured toward where Mrs. Park was tending the plants. "And Seraphine, and friends, and people who love you." "Is Seraphine my umma now?" It was the question that Myung-seok had been uncertain how to interpret. Seraphine's answer, which she'd worked out in private conversations, was always the same. "I'm not replacing your umma. No one can replace her. But I'm someone who loves you and chooses to be here, and that's a different kind of love. Both kinds are real. She's your umma in a new way," Myung-seok said now. "Like I'm your grandfather, but also like someone who chose to stay because she wanted to, not because family made her." Junha nodded as if this made sense, which it did in the way that children's logic often exceeds adult attempts to complicate things. "I want to go sing with Seraphine," he announced, as if this solved the matter entirely. And perhaps it did. That evening, they held the wedding celebration that had been planned for months. Not a redo of the spring wedding, but rather a gathering of the people who'd been crucial to the formation of this family. Yoon-hee came, and Ji-woo, the cultural reporter who'd transformed the narrative around Myung-seok's resignation from scandal into story, and colleagues from the company who wanted to verify that the former CEO had, in fact, managed to be happy outside of corporate structure. His ex-wife came, and Minjun's friends, and Seraphine's brother's colleagues from the NGO, where she'd worked before David's death. People who understood loss and had watched her move from that loss into something resembling recovery. Junha, dressed again in a small suit he immediately tried to remove, sang the song that Seraphine had taught him. "I am here. You are here. Together, we are somewhere." It was simple. It was probably not grammatically perfect in either Korean or English, but it contained the entire philosophy of what this family had become. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but a genuine attempt to create something new that honored what came before. Epilogue. The breathing. 2 years later, when Junha was 5 and starting school in earnest, Myung-seok received a call from Park Ji-hwan, the board chairman who'd tried to force him into abandoning Seraphine. "I'm stepping down from the board," Park said without preamble, effective immediately. "Why are you telling me this?" Myung-seok asked carefully. "Because I saw your grandson at a school event. He was singing in Korean, then in Vietnamese, then in English. This strange mix that made no sense by any traditional cultural standard. And I watched him do it with complete confidence, as if he understood something that I've spent my entire life trying to prevent." Park paused. He understood that you don't have to be one thing, that your identity can contain multitudes, that a little boy can have a grandfather who runs a company and then stops running a company, can have a mother who died and a stepmother who chose him, can sing in languages that don't natively belong to him, and somehow he seemed happy about this. "What do you want from this call?" Myung-seok asked, though he suspected he knew. "I want to know if it's too late," Park said. "If I'm too old, too rigid, too committed to the way things are supposed to be. If I could learn what your grandson learned so easily." Myung-seok thought about this carefully. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What I know is that change is possible, that people can reorganize their lives around different values. But it requires surrender, real surrender, not the kind where you maintain control while appearing to let go. It requires listening to people you've trained yourself to dismiss. It requires being wrong. I'm good at being wrong," Park said. "I've just never admitted it." The breathing that had started on an airplane continued, changed forms, became the baseline of Myung-seok's existence instead of the interruption. It was the sound of Junha falling asleep against Seraphine's shoulder. It was the hum of Mrs. Park's gardening, the quiet of the hanok house where water sounds and wind sounds had replaced the aggressive ambient noise of the penthouse. It was the sound of someone learning to live instead of perform. Years later, when Junha was old enough to ask real questions about loss and legacy, and what it meant that his original parents had been erased by accident, Myung-seok would tell him the true story. That love wasn't about replacement or hierarchy, but about the willingness to show up, day after day, year after year, for people who mattered. He would tell him about a woman on an airplane who stood up when a child was screaming, who breathed slowly and deliberately, who understood that the greatest power was the willingness to sit with someone else's pain. He would tell him that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that nobody notices. The small miracle of a child learning to rest against a stranger's shoulder, a CEO learning to let go, a woman learning that it was finally safe to stop running. He would tell him that not every flight has a destination. Some have a purpose, and this one had changed everything. He would tell him about the breathing, that slow, deliberate rhythm that transforms everything it touches, about how his appa had learned it too, in those final moments, and how it had saved his life in ways that no amount of money or power ever could. And Junha would understand, in the way that children understand the deepest truths, that the real inheritance wasn't a company or a name or a place in a hierarchy. It was the knowledge that you could survive your own grief, that you could breathe even when it hurt, that you could let someone else hold you while you learned to be whole again. The breathing would become their family's heartbeat, the rhythm that held them through seasons and changes and all the small transformations that made a life real.